Sothen had been watching Earth for 11 years. It was not a glamorous job. Among the Vilathi, being assigned to monitor a young species was considered a career dead end, something given to analysts who lacked ambition or had angered the wrong superior. Sothen had done both. He sat alone in the monitoring station on the frozen edge of Sol system, surrounded by screens that showed him everything humanity did. Their news broadcasts, their music, their endless arguments about politics and religion and what to eat for dinner. Humans were, by any measure, the loudest species the galactic Concord had ever observed. They talked constantly. They broadcast everything. They seemed physically unable to keep a secret. That was what made the silence so terrifying. It began at 03:17 Concord Standard Time on what humans called a Tuesday. Sothen was half asleep at his console, letting the usual wash of human radio chatter play in the background like a lullaby. He had grown fond of it over the years, though he would never admit that to anyone. There was something comforting about a species that never stopped talking. Then the talking stopped. It did not fade. It did not stutter. It stopped, all of it, all at once, as if someone had reached into the planet and pulled out its voice. Radio went dead. Television feeds cut to black. Satellite uplinks ceased transmitting. The quantum link relays that connected Earth to its colonies on Luna and Mars fell silent. Even the background hum of civilian devices, the billions of tiny signals that leaked from phones and computers and kitchen appliances, vanished. Sothen sat up straight. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a Vilathi stress response. He ran a diagnostic on his equipment, certain that something had broken on his end. Everything was functioning perfectly. The problem was not with his instruments. The problem was that there was nothing to detect. He opened a channel to Fleet Overseer Damery, who commanded the Concord's observation fleet from a cruiser parked near Jupiter's orbit. Damery was Rithani, tall, scaled, and deeply uninterested in anything that required him to do additional work. "Overseer, Earth has gone silent," Sothen said. "Define silent." "No transmissions of any kind. Complete communication blackout across the entire planet and all orbital infrastructure." Damery was quiet for a moment. "How long?" 12 minutes so far." 12 minutes. Damery's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who did not consider this a problem. "Species go quiet, Sothen. Equipment failures, power grid collapses, internal conflicts. Give it an hour." "Sir, this is not a localized failure. Every signal source on the planet ceased at the same moment. That is not a power grid collapse. That is coordination. Or an electromagnetic pulse, or a solar event, or a dozen other explanations that do not require me to file paperwork at this hour. Monitor and report. Damery out." The channel closed. Sothen stared at his screens. They stared back, empty and dark, showing him a planet that had simply stopped speaking. He waited an hour, then 2, then 6. The silence held. By the 12-hour mark, Sothen had stopped pretending this was normal. He pulled the last transmissions Earth had made before the blackout and began analyzing them. What he found made his skin prickle, a sensation Vilathi experienced when their bodies recognized danger before their minds did. There was no panic in the final transmissions, no emergency broadcasts, no weapons fire, no explosions, no screaming. The last human voices he could find were calm, ordinary. A woman in a city called Lagos telling her children to come inside. A man in a place called Osaka closing his shop and locking the door. A news anchor in London finishing a sentence about weather and then nothing. But it was the pattern that disturbed him most. When he mapped the shutdown across the planet's surface, the signals did not die randomly. They died in sequence, a wave that started in the Pacific and rolled east, following the rotation of the planet, city by city, continent by continent, like a curtain being drawn across a window. Millions of transmitters falling silent in a pattern so precise it could only be deliberate. Humanity had not been attacked. Humanity had chosen to stop talking. Sothen filed a priority report with Concord Central, the governing body that oversaw 4,000 member species from a station orbiting a dead star called Kethval. The report was received, logged, and assigned a response category of low urgency. Continued monitoring advised. This was the Concord's way of saying they did not care. He tried Dommery again. The overseer listened to his findings about the transmission pattern and then said, "So they coordinated a communication shutdown. Interesting. Possibly a drill of some kind. Possibly a cultural event. Humans are strange, Sothen. This is not news." A cultural event that involves every person on a planet of 9 billion simultaneously going silent. I have seen stranger things from younger species. Continue monitoring. The channel closed again. Sothen sat in the dark of his station and listened to nothing. 24 hours passed, then 36. The silence was absolute. No ship left Earth's orbit. No signal leaked from the surface. The planet hung in space like a stone, present but lifeless, as if the humans had simply ceased to exist. Other Concord analysts began to notice. A Droshk intelligence officer sent a query to Sothen's station, asking if his equipment was malfunctioning. An ill-wary cultural researcher noted the silence in a weekly report, adding a comment that read, "Humanity's sudden quiet is either very good or very bad. There is no middle ground with this species." Sothen agreed with the ill-wary. He could not sleep. He could not look away from his screens. Something in his training, or perhaps something older and deeper than training, told him that what he was witnessing was not an ending. It was a held breath. At the 48-hour mark, he detected something new. It was not a transmission. It was not a signal in any way he understood. It was a vibration, deep, rhythmic, and impossibly powerful, rising from the core of the Earth itself. His instruments could detect it but could not classify it. It matched nothing in the Concord's databases. It was not geological. It was not mechanical. It was something else entirely. Sothen stared at the reading. The vibration pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and patient, as if the planet itself had woken up and was waiting for something. He opened a channel to Dommery one more time. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Overseer, something is happening." 72 hours after the silence began, the Concorde finally sent ships. It was not a fleet. The Concorde did not waste fleets on young species. It was 3 observation vessels, lightly armed, fast, designed for survey work rather than combat. Fleet Overseer Dommery commanded them from his cruiser near Jupiter, though "commanded" was a generous word. He had been ordered to investigate by Concorde Central, and he did so with the enthusiasm of a man told to check on a noise in the basement. Sothen watched from his station as the 3 ships entered the inner Sol system. They passed Mars without incident. They crossed the asteroid belt. They approached Earth on a trajectory that would bring them within visual range of the planet's surface. They never got that close. At 07:41 Concorde Standard Time, Sothen's instruments screamed. Every sensor he had went white with data. Energy signatures, mass displacement readings, gravitational fluctuations, all spiking beyond anything his equipment was designed to measure. For a terrible moment, he thought the planet was exploding. It was not exploding, it was opening. The first ships rose from the oceans. They came up through the water in pillars of steam and spray, their hulls shedding seawater as they climbed. They were enormous carriers and battleships, angular and dark, covered in plating that seemed to drink the light. They rose in rows, in columns, in formations so tight and precise that they looked like a single organism unfolding rather than individual vessels launching. Then the mountains split open. In the Himalayas, in the Andes, in the Rockies, and the Alps, entire mountainsides swung apart on hidden hinges to reveal construction bays that stretched for kilometers underground. Ships poured out of them, cruisers, destroyers, frigates, climbing straight up into the sky on drives that made no sound and left no exhaust trail. The deserts opened next. In the Sahara, in the Gobi, in the vast emptiness of the Australian outback, the sand fell away into massive sinkholes as underground hangars released their contents. Then the forests, then the ice caps, then the ocean floors, where the deep trenches had hidden the largest construction facilities of all. Sothen could not count them. His instruments tried and failed. overwhelmed by the sheer number of contacts appearing on his screens. He switched to automated tallying and watched the number climb. 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000. The count did not stop. Ships were still rising from every corner of the planet, filling low orbit in a cloud of metal and energy that blotted out the stars behind them. The final count, when his systems finally stabilized, was 487,312 vessels. 500,000 ships, built in secret, hidden beneath the surface of a planet that the conquered had been watching for over a century. Sothan's 4 eyes could not blink. His body had locked into a Vilathi fear response, total stillness, every muscle rigid, every sense sharpened to its maximum. He stared at his screens and felt something he had not felt in his 11 years of quiet, boring service, genuine terror. The ships were not like anything in the Conquered's records. Human vessels had always been crude, functional, but ugly, held together by brute engineering and stubbornness. These were different. Their hulls were smooth and dense, made of materials that Sothan's scanners could not identify. Their energy signatures were wrong, too powerful, too strange, operating on principles that his equipment could not interpret. Some of the larger ships seemed to bend the space around them slightly, as if their mass was not entirely contained in 3 dimensions. And they were silent. 500,000 ships, and not one of them transmitted a single signal. No identification codes, no navigation beacons, no communication of any kind. They rose, they formed up, and they waited, as quiet as the planet they had come from. Domiri's 3 observation vessels found themselves surrounded. The human fleet had risen around them like a tide, and now they sat in the middle of a formation so vast that they could not see its edges. Domiri transmitted a hail on every frequency his communication systems could reach. He used every human language in his database. He used Conquered Standard. He used mathematics, the universal fallback. Nothing, the human ships did not respond. They did not even seem to notice. Then the largest vessel appeared. It rose from the Mariana Trench, the deepest scar on Earth's ocean floor. Sothan's instruments detected it before he saw it, and what they told him made no sense. The mass readings were impossible. The energy output was beyond any scale his systems used. The ship climbed out of the ocean slowly, almost leisurely, shedding water in great cascading waterfalls that fell back to the sea from a height of several kilometers. It was over 12 kilometers long. Its hull was black, not painted black, but made of something that absorbed light completely, so that it looked like a hole cut in the shape of a ship. Sothan's scanners could not fully map it. Parts of the vessel seemed to exist in dimensions his instruments were not built to detect, giving it a shape that shifted depending on the angle of observation, as if the ship was more than what 3-dimensional space could contain. Sothan's automated systems designated it Vessel Zero. He did not give it a more creative name. He was too busy trying to remember how to breathe. Vessel Zero took its place at the center of the formation. Around it, 500,000 ships adjusted their positions with a precision that suggested they were not being commanded individually, but were moving as parts of a single mind. The fleet arranged itself into a shape, a vast, layered structure that stretched across millions of kilometers of space, pointed outward, away from Earth, away from the sun, toward the empty dark between the stars. Domiri's observation vessels tried to hail the fleet one more time. One of the smaller human frigates drifted close to them, not threatening, not aggressive, just close, and for a moment Sothan thought it might respond. Instead, it adjusted its course slightly and flowed past them, the way water flows around a stone in a river. The rest of the fleet did the same. The 3 conquered ships sat motionless as 500,000 human vessels moved around them, past them, and beyond them without a single acknowledgement. The fleet reached the edge of Sol system and stopped. Every ship, from the smallest corvette to the massive shadow of Vessel Zero, went still at the same moment. They hung in the dark like a wall of metal and silence, facing outward, facing nothing. Sothan stared at his screens for a long time. His fear had not faded, but something else was growing beside it, something that felt uncomfortably like awe. He had spent 11 years watching humans argue about food and politics and sports. He had written reports calling them disorganized, impulsive, and childish. He had agreed with every Concord assessment that dismissed them as a noisy young species that would probably destroy itself within a few centuries. He had been wrong. They had all been wrong. He opened a channel to Concord Central. His voice was hoarse, and he had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. "This is Analyst Southern, Sol System Monitoring Station. I am reporting a development. Humanity has launched a fleet of approximately 500,000 vessels from concealed positions across their home planet. The vessels are of unknown design and unknown capability. They are currently holding position at the edge of the system in a formation that faces outward toward deep space." He paused. He looked at his screens one more time, at the impossible wall of ships, at the dark shape of Vessel Zero at its center, at the silent planet behind them that had hidden all of this for decades. "They were not destroying themselves," he said quietly. "They were preparing." The emergency session of the Concord High Council began 6 hours after Southern's report reached Kethval. It was the fastest the council had ever assembled in its 4,000-year history, and even that felt too slow for what was happening. The chamber was vast, a hollow sphere carved into the station's core, lined with platforms where representatives of the elder species sat or stood or floated, depending on their biology. Normally, less than a third of the platforms were occupied for any given session. Today, every single one was full. 4,000 species had sent their voices to this room, and for the first time in living memory, all of them were talking about the same thing. Ambassador Uellen of the Rithani stood at the center of the chamber. She was old even by Rithani standards. Her scales had faded from green to silver, and her movements were slow and careful. But her mind was sharp, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had navigated Concord politics for longer than most human civilizations had existed. "We have confirmed the analyst's report," she said. "Approximately 500,000 human vessels are holding position at the boundary of their home system. They are not responding to any communication. Their technology does not match any known human capability. Our intelligence services have no record of the construction of these vessels." The last sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread through the chamber in whispers and hisses and clicking sounds that served as speech for a dozen different species. "How is that possible?" The question came from D. Hall Crean, a Droshk war commander whose insectoid body filled his platform like a clenched fist. The Droshk were the Concord's military backbone, aggressive, disciplined, and deeply suspicious of any species that built weapons. "We have monitored their planet for over a century. We have intercepted their communications. We have mapped their industrial output. How does a species build 500,000 warships without anyone noticing?" Uellen turned to the intelligence summary that floated in the air before her, a holographic display showing a century of data on human activity. "The answer is in the data we already had. We simply did not understand what we were looking at." She pulled up the records. Human industrial output over the past 60 years. Mining operations that exceeded civilian demand by enormous margins. Energy production that was 3 times what the planet's population required. Research programs in physics and engineering that published papers full of theoretical work but never seemed to produce practical applications. Construction projects in remote locations, deep ocean, underground polar regions, that were listed as scientific installations or resource extraction facilities. "We saw all of this," Uellen said. "Every piece of it was in our files. We dismissed it because it did not fit our model of what humanity was. We believed they were wasteful, inefficient, and disorganized. We assumed the excess production was a result of their chaotic economic systems. We were wrong. The waste was not waste. The inefficiency was not inefficiency. It was camouflage." The chamber was quiet. 4,000 species sat with the understanding that they had been fooled not by deception, but by their own assumptions. They had looked at humanity and seen what they expected to see, a loud, messy, young species stumbling through its early centuries. They had never considered that the noise might be deliberate, that behind the arguments and the entertainment and the endless broadcasting, An entire civilization was quietly building something vast. D. Hallkreen broke the silence. It does not matter how they did it. What matters is what they intend to do with it. 500,000 warships pointed at deep space is either the beginning of an expansion or a threat. Either way, the conquered must respond with force. "We do not know they are warships," said Tellenra, representative of the Ilwari. The Ilwari were among the oldest species in the conquered, thin, translucent beings who communicated through patterns of light that rippled across their skin. They had not fought a war in over 10,000 years and had a reputation for seeing things others missed. "We know they are ships. We know they are armed. But a species does not build 500,000 vessels in secret just to conquer its neighbors. That is not secrecy, that is preparation. The question is, preparation for what? Does it matter?" D. Hallkreen's mandibles clicked with impatience. "Whatever they are preparing for, they chose to hide it from us. That alone is an act of hostility." "Or an act of distrust," Tellenra replied calmly. "The two are not the same." The debate continued for hours. It followed the pattern that all conquered debates followed, a slow, grinding process of consensus building that moved at the speed of the most cautious participant. Hawks demanded military mobilization. Moderates pushed for diplomatic engagement. Neutrals requested more data. The Ilwari sat quietly and watched, their skin flickering with patterns that none of the other species could fully read. In the end, the council authorized both options. A diplomatic shuttle, unarmed, carrying a crew of 6, equipped with translation systems for every known human language, would be sent to the human fleet to attempt communication. At the same time, Fleet Overseer Dommery was ordered to assemble an armada. The mobilization order went out to 40 species. Within days, ships began arriving from across conquered space, Droshk dreadnoughts bristling with weapons, Rithani cruisers with their elegant curved hulls, Vilathi science vessels repurposed for combat duty. The armada grew to 1.2 million ships, making it the largest military force the conquered had ever assembled. It positioned itself at a safe distance from the human fleet, close enough to strike, far enough to react. Sa then watched the buildup from his station. He had been reassigned from his monitoring post to the diplomatic team, not because of his expertise, but because he was the only conquered analyst who had been watching when the silence began. He was the closest thing they had to someone who understood what was happening. He did not feel like he understood anything. The diplomatic shuttle launched on the 4th day after the ascension. It was a small vessel, barely 50 meters long, crewed by specialists from 6 different species. It crossed the gap between the conquered armada and the human fleet slowly, broadcasting greetings in every human language stored in its database, then in conquered standard, then in pure mathematics. The human fleet did not respond. The shuttle continued forward, passing the outer edge of the formation, moving deeper into the silent wall of ships. Sa then monitored its progress from the conquered flagship and held his breath. The shuttle reached a point roughly 300 kilometers from Vessel 0 and stopped. It transmitted one final greeting, a simple message of peace, and a request for dialogue, and waited. 6 hours passed. Sa then did not move from his console. Around him, the conquered command staff grew restless, arguing about whether the shuttle should withdraw, whether the fleet should advance, whether this silence was itself a message. Then, at the 6-hour mark, the shuttle received a reply. It was a single transmission, broadcast on a frequency the shuttle's systems almost missed because it was so precisely targeted. The message was in perfect conquered standard, not translated, not approximated, but spoken with the fluency of a native speaker. It contained one sentence: "We are not here for you." The shuttle's crew transmitted the message back to the conquered flagship. The command staff fell silent. D. Hallkreen's mandibles stopped clicking. Uellen, watching from Kethval, closed her eyes. Sa then read the message on his screen 3 times. 5 words. 5 words that answered nothing and changed everything. If the human fleet was not pointed at the conquered, if this was not about territory or power or expansion, then the question Tellenra had asked became the only question that mattered. Preparation for what? He looked at the data he had been collecting since the silence began, the strange vibration from Earth's core, the impossible energy readings from the fleet, the technology that defied conquered understanding. He looked at the wall of ships facing outward into the dark, away from the galaxy, away from everything known. And for the first time, he felt something colder than fear. He felt the beginning of understanding. Sothen was the one who found the connection. It was not brilliance that led him to it. It was stubbornness, a quality he had always considered a flaw in himself and now recognized as something he shared with the species he had spent a decade watching. The vibration from Earth's core had been bothering him since he first detected it. It was too regular to be natural, too powerful to be mechanical, and too strange to be anything in the Concord's databases. He had run it through every classification system available to him and received the same answer each time: unknown. So he did what no one else thought to do. He stopped trying to classify it and started looking for it elsewhere. He searched the Concord's deep space sensor archives, decades of data collected by long-range arrays scattered across the galaxy. Most of it was noise. Background radiation, stellar winds, the ordinary hum of a universe doing nothing in particular. But buried in the noise, so faint that automated systems had filtered it out as irrelevant, he found a match. The same frequency, the same rhythm, coming from beyond the galactic rim. It was not a signal in the way the Concorde understood signals. It was not communication. It was more like a sound, a deep, slow vibration that traveled through the fabric of space itself, detectable only if you knew exactly what to listen for. And it was old. Based on the signal degradation, Sothen estimated it had been traveling for millions of years, possibly longer. It predated the Concorde. It predated every known civilization. It might have predated the galaxy. He brought his findings to Ambassador Llewellyn. She looked at the data for a long time, her silver scales reflecting the light of the holographic displays. Then she authorized him to do something that no Concorde analyst had ever done: board a human vessel and ask them directly what was happening. The diplomatic shuttle carried him across the gap between the Armada and the human fleet. This time, the fleet responded. A corridor opened in the formation, ships shifting aside to create a path that led directly to Vessel Zero. The shuttle followed it, dwarfed by the vessels on either side, and docked at a bay that opened in the great ship's hull like a mouth. The interior of Vessel Zero was not what Sothen expected. He had prepared himself for something alien and intimidating, but the corridors were simple metal walls, white lighting, air that smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and coffee. Humans walked past him in uniforms, nodding politely but not stopping. They did not seem surprised to see him. They had been expecting him. He was taken to a room near the center of the ship. It was a command center of some kind, filled with displays showing data he could not read and maps of regions he did not recognize. At its center stood a woman. Admiral Cora Vazic was not tall. She was not physically imposing. She had dark hair cut short, lines around her eyes that spoke of years without enough sleep, and hands that were steady in the way that only hands accustomed to carrying heavy burdens could be. She looked at Sothen with eyes that were tired and kind and absolutely certain of what she was about to say. "You found the signal," she said. It was not a question. "I did, from beyond the rim." "What is it?" Vazic gestured to a display. It showed a map of the local universe, not just the galaxy but the space around it, the vast emptiness between galaxies where nothing was supposed to exist. Except something did exist there now. Vazic highlighted it, a boundary, moving slowly inward, still impossibly far away, but approaching with the patience of something that had all the time in the universe. 60 years ago, she said, we pointed a new kind of telescope at the space between galaxies. We were looking for dark matter signatures. What we found was this. She expanded the display. The boundary became clearer, not a wall or a line, but a region where the data simply stopped. Stars beyond it were dimmer than they should have been. Galaxies that should have been visible were not. It was as if something was eating the universe from the outside in, slowly and quietly, one piece at a time. "We call it the unraveling," Vazic said. It is not a species, it is not a weapon. It is a phenomenon, something that breaks down the fundamental forces that hold matter together. Where it passes, atoms stop being atoms. Energy stops being energy. Everything that exists becomes nothing, not destroyed, unmade. Returned to a state before physics had rules. Sothen stared at the display. His mind was trying to reject what he was seeing, but the data was clear. How fast is it moving? Slowly, by cosmic standards, almost imperceptibly. But it is accelerating. Based on our models, it will reach the edge of this galaxy in approximately 140 years. And when it arrives, everything ends. Not just life, everything. Stars, planets, space itself. The galaxy will simply cease to be, the same way at least two others already have. Sothen felt his body go cold. The Vilathi did not experience shock the way humans did. They did not gasp or cry out. Instead, they went very still, every process in their body slowing to conserve energy for the crisis ahead. He stood motionless for a long time, processing. "You have known about this for 60 years, he said finally. "Yes." "And you told no one." Vazik looked at him. There was no guilt in her expression, but there was weight, the weight of a decision that had cost her species its relationship with the rest of the galaxy. "We ran the simulations, Sothen, all of them. We modeled what would happen if we brought this to the Concord." He pulled up another display. Simulation results, thousands of them branching into probability trees that covered every possible outcome of disclosure. The Concord operates by consensus. 4,000 species, each with their own politics, their own fears, their own priorities. In every simulation, the same thing happened. Decades of debate over whether the threat was real. More decades of debate over how to respond. Species withdrawing from the Concord to focus on their own survival. Resource wars. Panic, fragmentation. By the time anyone agreed on a plan of action, it would be too late. "You decided for us," Sothen said. His voice was flat. "We decided for ourselves," Vazik corrected. "We decided that someone had to build the wall, and that the wall had to be ready before the storm arrived. We could not afford to wait for permission." She walked to a window, a real window, not a display, showing the stars beyond the hull. 500,000 ships floated in the darkness around them, silent and waiting. Everything you saw, the silence, the fleet, the secrecy, it all served one purpose. For 60 years, every human being on Earth worked toward this. Scientists, engineers, factory workers, farmers, teachers, children. Everyone knew. Everyone contributed. Everyone kept the secret. Not because they were ordered to, but because they understood what was at stake. Sothen thought about the transmissions he had monitored for 11 years. The arguments, the music, the ordinary chaos of human life. All of it continuing as normal on the surface while beneath it, 9 billion people quietly built the tools to save a galaxy that did not know it needed saving. "The noise," he said slowly. "The broadcasts, the chatter, it was all cover." "Not all of it," Vazik said, and for the first time something that might have been a smile crossed her face. "We really do argue that much, but yes, we made sure the Concord kept hearing what it expected to hear. A loud, messy, young species too busy fighting with itself to be a threat. It was the truth, mostly. We just left out the part where we were also building a fleet in our basement." Sothen was quiet for a long time. He looked at the data on the unraveling, at the probability models, at the fleet hanging in the void outside. He thought about the Concord, its slow deliberations, its careful consensus, its 4,000 voices that could never agree on anything quickly enough. He thought about what would happen when he brought this information back. "What do you need from the Concord?" he asked. Vazik turned from the window and looked at him. Her eyes were steady. "We are not asking for help. We are not asking for permission. We are not asking for forgiveness for keeping this secret. We are asking for one thing only." She paused. "Stay behind us." Sothen returned to the Concord flagship carrying the data on the unraveling. He presented it to the command staff, who verified it with their own long-range sensors. The readings matched. The threat was real. For the first time in its recorded history, the Concord High Council had nothing to say. The Concord Armada stood down without ceremony. There was no vote, no debate, no formal resolution. The 1.2 million ships that had been assembled to threaten humanity simply stopped being a threat. Commanders received orders to hold position and observe. Weapons systems were powered down. The largest military force in conquered history became an audience. It was Telen-Ra of the Ilwari who said what everyone was thinking. In the silence of the council chamber, where 4,000 species sat with the knowledge of what was coming, the ancient being flickered with soft light and spoke. We spent centuries judging them. Now they go to die for us. Let them pass. The human fleet moved on the seventh day. Sothen watched from the conquered flagship as 500,000 vessels activated their drives simultaneously. The energy output was staggering. Every sensor on every conquered ship overloaded for a brief, blinding moment. When they recovered, the human fleet was gone. Not accelerating, not moving, simply gone, as if the space they had occupied had folded in on itself and deposited them somewhere else entirely. Conquered physicists would later determine that the human drives did not push ships through space. They folded the dimensions around the vessel, slipping it between layers of reality like a hand sliding between pages of a book. The technology was at least 3 centuries beyond anything the conquered had theorized. Humanity had not just caught up with the elder species. They had passed them so completely that the gap was no longer measurable. The fleet reappeared at the galactic rim. The journey that would have taken the fastest conquered ship decades took the human fleet 4 days. They emerged into the thin, dark space at the edge of the galaxy, where stars grew sparse and the light was old, and they arranged themselves into a wall. It stretched across thousands of light years, a line of metal and energy and human will, positioned directly in the path of the unraveling. The ships locked into formation and activated their hull resonance systems. That same vibration Sothen had detected from Earth's core, the deep, rhythmic pulse that matched the signal from beyond the rim, now radiated from every vessel in the fleet. Space around them thickened, as if reality itself was being reinforced, made denser and more certain of its own existence. A small conquered observation flotilla followed, arriving weeks after the human fleet. Sothen was aboard, his monitoring station replaced by a seat on the bridge of a Vilathi science vessel. He wanted to see what happened next. He needed to. The unraveling arrived on the 32nd day. There was no army, no invasion fleet, no enemy with a face or a name or a reason. There was only a boundary, a place where things stopped being things. Sothen watched through his instruments as the edge of it became visible on long-range sensors. Stars ahead of the fleet began to dim. Not burning out, not collapsing, dimming, as if the light they produced was being gently discouraged. Behind the dimming stars there was nothing. Not darkness, not empty space, but an absence so complete that sensors returned no data at all. It was as if the universe simply ended, and what lay beyond the ending was not a place. It moved with terrible patience. Slowly, inevitably, the way a tide moves, not rushed, not aggressive, just certain. It had consumed galaxies. It could afford to be slow. The human fleet fired. The weapons were not weapons in any way Sothen understood. There were no projectiles, no beams, no explosions. Instead, the ships projected something outward, waves of structured energy that rippled through space like sound through water. Where the waves touched the boundary of the unraveling, the dimming stopped. Stars that had been fading steadied and brightened. Matter that had been losing its cohesion pulled itself back together. Sothen analyzed the readings and realized what he was seeing. The humans were not shooting at the unraveling. They were reinforcing reality. Their weapons projected patterns of coherence, mathematical structures that told matter and energy what they were, reminded the fundamental forces of the universe how to behave. They were fighting entropy with definition, chaos with order, nothingness with the stubborn insistence that something should exist. It was physics used as a weapon, existence itself used as ammunition. The battle, though Sothen struggled to call it that, lasted 11 days. On the first day, the human line held easily. The unraveling pressed against the wall of coherence and slowed, like a river meeting a dam. The fleet maintained its formation, each ship contributing its output to the collective field. On the third day, the unraveling adapted. It did not think, it was not alive in any sense Sothen could determine, but it responded. It pushed harder in places where the coherence was thinner, found gaps between ships, pressed into them with patient force. The human fleet adjusted, filling holes, redistributing power, shifting vessels to reinforce weak points. On the fifth day, the first ships were lost. A carrier group on the left flank suffered a cascade failure in their coherence projectors. The unraveling touched them. Sothen watched through his instruments as 12 ships simply came apart, not destroyed, not damaged, but unmade. The metal of their hulls stopped being metal. The energy in their reactors stopped being energy. The people inside stopped being people. Everything they were dissolved into the same nothingness that waited beyond the boundary. Sothen had to look away. When he looked back, the gap had been filled by reserve ships moving into position without hesitation. On the seventh day, Admiral Vazic ordered a rotation. Frontline vessels whose projectors were weakening pulled back, and fresh ships took their places. The exchange was executed flawlessly, without a single word of communication. The fleet moved as one organism, each ship knowing its role and its place. Sothen realized that this was what the 60 years of preparation had produced. Not just ships and weapons, but a species that had learned to act as a single body, each person a cell, each vessel an organ. On the ninth day, the losses mounted. Entire sections of the line buckled under sustained pressure. Ships were consumed in groups of dozens, then hundreds. The reserve fleet shrank. Vessel Zero moved to the center of the weakest section, its massive coherence projectors pouring out more energy than entire battle groups combined. And Vazic held the line there through what Sothen could only describe as force of will. On the 10th day, something changed. The unraveling's advance slowed, not by much fractions of a percent, barely detectable, but Sothen saw it in his data, and his heart, or the Vilathi equivalent, began to beat faster. The human weapons were working. The reinforced reality was not just holding, it was pushing back. The fundamental forces of the universe, reminded of what they were supposed to do, were choosing to keep doing it. On the 11th day, the unraveling stopped. It did not collapse. It did not disappear. It simply ceased its advance, as if meeting a wall it could not pass. The boundary held dimmed stars on one side, living stars on the other, and between them, a line of battered human ships radiating the stubborn certainty that this was where the universe ended and no further. Then slowly, the boundary began to recede. It pulled back, not much, not far, but enough. The dimmed stars behind it began to brighten again. Space that had been losing its identity remembered what it was. The human fleet had lost 62,408 ships, 143 million people. Sothen let that number sit in his mind and tried to understand it. 143 million people who had gone to the edge of the galaxy knowing they might not come back, and who had gone anyway because the alternative was everything and everyone ceasing to exist. The remaining ships held their positions. They did not celebrate. They did not transmit victory messages or triumphant broadcasts. They simply stayed where they were, projectors still running, still watching the boundary, still reinforcing the line. The unraveling had been pushed back, but it had not been destroyed. It was still out there, vast and patient, and it would try again. Sothen wrote his final report from the observation flotilla as it began its long journey back to conquered space. It was a technical document, full of data and analysis and recommendations for future monitoring. But at the end, he added something that was not technical. He added something personal. It was not done in the conquered tradition. Reports were meant to be objective, free of opinion, free of emotion, free of the kind of personal reflection that the elder species considered unprofessional. Sothen did not care. He had watched a species sacrifice 143 million of its own to save a galaxy that had spent centuries looking down on them. He had earned the right to say what he felt. He wrote, "For centuries we asked ourselves why humans were so restless, so aggressive, so unwilling to be still. They fought everything, each other, their environment, the limits of their own biology. They were loud when silence would have served them. They were stubborn when flexibility would have been wiser. They burned with an intensity that the elder species found exhausting and, frankly, embarrassing. We theorized that it was immaturity, evolutionary excess, a flaw that they would either outgrow or be destroyed by. We watched them from a comfortable distance and shook our heads and said, "They will learn or they will die." We were wrong. Humans were never restless without reason. They fought because they sensed something the rest of us did not, or perhaps because they refused to look away from something we all sensed but chose to ignore. They looked into the dark before any of us thought to, and they saw something there. And instead of despairing, instead of coming to us so that we could all despair together, they decided to do something about it. They built their fleet in silence. They prepared their weapons in secret. They held the greatest secret in the history of the galaxy for 60 years, and they held it not out of malice or distrust, but because they knew that if they waited for the rest of us to act, we would still be debating when the darkness arrived. They held the line not because they were asked to, not because they were ordered to, not because they expected gratitude or reward. They held it because they decided that someone had to, and they did not trust anyone else to do it in time. I do not know what the conquered owes them. I suspect we can never repay it. But I know this: the galaxy is still here. The stars still burn. Matter still holds together, and the laws of physics still function, and every species in the conquered is alive today because one noisy, stubborn, impossible species fell silent long enough to save us all. They remain at the rim. They are still watching. The unraveling has not gone, it has only paused, and when it returns, they will be there. Someone has to hold the line. Humanity decided it would be them. He sent the report. Then he turned off his console, sat back in his chair, and looked out the viewport at the stars, the billions of stars that were still shining, still burning, still being stars. And for the first time in his life, Sathan understood why humans never stopped fighting. It was because they had something worth fighting for, and they had decided, long before anyone asked them, that they would not let it go.